breaking news. John Calipari is finalizing a 5-year deal to become the Arkansas Razorbacks' next head coach, covering college sports like no one else. The biggest guests in sports. We now welcome in Hall of Famer Jim Calhoun.
Such a pride I had, I came to connect.
The legend, Tim Tebow, joins us.
We'll run it back. I like it.
The legend, Herschel Walker. Welcome in, everybody. Sunday night edition, Aaron Torres Sports Podcast. I'm your host, Aaron Torres. Hope everybody's doing well. Hope everybody's having a great day. And people, I got some good news. For the first time since January, college football to react to. Okay, so we had week 0. It is gone. We are in game week for everybody in college football. But we got ourselves a jam-packed show here on a Sunday. And boy, oh boy, is there a lot to talk about. We will obviously open the stunner in Dublin. Florida State, top 10 team in the country. They are a top 10 team no more. They fall to Georgia Tech. What does it mean for Florida State? What does it mean for Georgia Tech? Yes, it's the 12-team playoff era, but I think there's some big picture ramifications that need to be discussed. From there, we'll probably hit on, just for a minute or two, the other big games and the other games in general from week 0. 3 other results. 2 of the games were actually very entertaining. So we'll talk about week 0. From there, we'll take a quick break, and we're all football today. Full speed ahead with football. A few weeks ago, I put out my way too early college football playoff picks. Today, we finalize them. Who do I have winning? How do I have it going down? By the way, hate to brag, but remember last year I picked Michigan to win the national championship in the preseason. I know it's easy to sit back and say, oh, everybody could have seen that coming. No. Most people had Bama. Most people had Georgia. Not a lot of people had Michigan. Torres did, so we'll see if I can go 2 for 2. And then finally, we will wrap after we give my playoff picks. Also, I will give my Heisman pick, which I have not officially done yet. We will go ahead and talk a little bit about the big news on Friday. UConn, my alma mater. There are renewed rumors, whatever you want to call it, about the Big 12 and UConn, a flirtation. I'll tell you everything I know. I'm a little more dubious on it than most, but I'll explain what I know, timelines, things like that. Before we get started, a couple quick things. One, make sure that you are subscribed to the Aaron Torres Sports Podcast. You could subscribe on Apple, subscribe on Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. Go ahead and make sure to do that. If you want to do your boy a favor, leave a 5-star rating and review as well. Would appreciate that. Make sure you're subscribed on YouTube. We're full speed ahead. So excited about the football season. By the way, little bit of a scheduling note, housekeeping note. We're going to have a jam-packed week here on the pod feed, okay, and the YouTube feed as well. Monday night, we will have my buddy Trey Wallace from Outkick. He is going to join me. Love talking ball with him. He covers the SEC, I believe, as well as anybody in the country. So we're going to talk some SEC with him. Tuesday night, we will be making our official week 1 pick. So we're talking Florida, Miami, Clemson, Georgia, Texas A&M, Notre Dame, LSU, USC, a game I almost went to but couldn't quite get there. Couldn't get out to Vegas this weekend. So tonight we're talking ball. Monday night, Trey Wallace from Outkick. Tuesday night, our official week 1 picks. And then we will be back on Thursday night recapping Colorado, North Dakota State, Minnesota, North Carolina, on and on and on. Football season is here, and I cannot wait. Speaking of football, it was a jam-packed weekend, so let's go ahead and dive in. There is no more time to waste, so let's get to the topic of the day. You don't need me to tell you, people, college football is back. College football is back in a big way. That is right. Saturday, week 0. And listen, I know that on Friday's show, I kind of poo-pooed week 0. We need more big games, all that. But once the games kicked off, they were awesome. And there is obviously only one place to start, right? It is Dublin, Ireland, the game we spent a ton of time talking about on Friday's show. Georgia Tech, Florida State a 10.5-point favorite. I said bluntly, this felt like a total stay away to me. 2 pseudo-erratic quarterbacks in DJU and Haynes King. What side do you take? I'm just staying away. Well, I bring it up because it was a little quirky. It was a little bit different, but it delivered in a way that college football always does, as Georgia Tech, 10.5-point underdog, walk-off field goal. First game of the year, knocks off the 10th-ranked Florida State Seminoles. Before we even start breaking down this game, let me start by saying this. All offseason, we spend so much time talking about the positives, the negatives of college football. NIL, portal, is it out of control? This 12-team playoff, do we like it? Do we not like it? Well, guess what? Once the games kick off, this sport always delivered, and it is no exception, as in quite literally the first game of the year, we get a top 10 upset as Florida State falls. So let's go ahead and dive in. Obviously, look, we could start with Georgia Tech, and it's no disrespect, but the story here is Florida State. We'll get to Georgia Tech in a minute, but we're not one of these shows that you always have to start with the winning team. No. As I always say, as my buddy Colin Cowherd says, we are in the interesting business, and seeing Florida State as a top 10 team lose is certainly the more interesting part of this story. Now, before we get into it, got to give the preface, got to give the disclaimer, if you will. Yes, I understand that this is a 12-team playoff era, and we don't need to overreact. Florida State could lose this one. They could lose in a week from now. They could lose in a month from now. They could be 9-3 or 8-4. But if they get to Charlotte for that ACC championship game, if they win the ACC, then they're not only in the playoff, but they're a top 4 team in that playoff. So obviously, any of these games early in the season, they just don't have the same meaning that they did even a year ago. Okay, and by the way, it's not just Florida State. It's going to be the same for next week. If Clemson loses to Georgia, or if LSU loses to USC, or if Texas A&M loses at home, I get that. But at the same time, as I look at that game for Florida State, I think it was really bad. And I think there are some big picture concerns that you got to have if you're a Florida State fan. And I think the big picture concern that, in my opinion, is very clearly going to follow this team all season long is that they kind of got punked at the line of scrimmage. And it's wild because you go back to our preview on Friday's show and why I just couldn't get excited about Florida State. I'm not a huge DJU guy. Not a knock, not trying to criticize, not saying he's the worst person that's ever walked the face of the earth. But as a college football player, he's been inconsistent. He's been erratic. 57% completion percentage last year at Oregon State. But the one thing that I figured is that whether I like DJU, whether I don't like DJU, is that at the very least, they would be so good in the trenches that it wouldn't matter how good, maybe in one game a year against Clemson or Miami or whatever, maybe you need DJU to make a play. But this Florida State program, as Mike Norvell has built it, has been dominant in the trenches. 2 years ago, led the ACC in rushing. Last year, you go back, you think about how dominant both the O-line was, but also the D-line, Braden Fisk, Jared Verse, Patrick Payton, who's obviously back this year as well. And so that was the shocker. I can't blame DJU. And if you're a Florida State fan tuning in, I promise I am not blaming DJU, because what was the shocker of all shockers was how Georgia Tech just dominated the line of scrimmage. Opening drive, Florida State marches down the field, scripted plays, whatever. After that, Georgia Tech just absolutely got after it. I mean, the stats are kind of stunning when you look at it, okay? Because here's the bottom line, is that we knew that Florida State was really good last year and that there was a possibility that they could take a step back this year. But Georgia Tech last year, you understand, they had the 120th ranked total defense in all of college football out of 133 FBS teams. By the way, 128th in rush defense. So you'd think at the very least, Florida State beats them up, runs it all over them. They'll be fine. They'll figure it out. Maybe they're not perfect, but they got plenty of time. They're going to win this game, whatever. Instead, it was Georgia Tech that looked like they got the dudes up front that are going to potentially lead them to potentially a special season in the ACC. Bottom line, just look at the stats, okay? On offense, Georgia Tech running against a Florida State defensive line that, again, lost a lot, but they still got NFL dudes up front. 190 yards rushing for Georgia Tech, 5.5 yards almost per carry for the Yellow Jackets. Now, they ran the ball well last year, but 5.5 yards per carry against Florida State, that is big time. But I think as impressive was what that defensive front did to Florida State. Florida State, listen, They lost some guys, but they got a lot of experience on that offensive line. I believe the stat is like 60-plus starts for their 5 offensive linemen as college football players. Well, did you see what Georgia Tech did to them? They held them to 98 yards rushing, about 3.2 yards per carry, 7 TFLs, right around 300 yards of total offense. But here's the crazy part, 290 yards of total offense in total. Take away the opening drive when Florida State marched down the field, 7 plays, 75 yards. Florida State had 216 yards of total offense in that game. And if you take out the 2 big booming field goals, I mean, their field goal kicker was the best player on that team on Saturday, and it's not enough. And I think for me, that's my concern with Florida State, is not that they're terrible, not that they can't bounce back and potentially compete for the ACC championship. And again, if you make the ACC championship, if you win the ACC championship, you're in the playoff. But the bigger concern is, look at this schedule. Why are we to believe that they're just going to suddenly be able to just dominate both lines of scrimmage? Play Clemson by the end of September. By the way, the game at SMU, I don't think is a gimme. SMU, we'll see. But at SMU, not a gimme. Clemson, a week later at home. Then you got Miami the end of October. North Carolina's got dudes. You got Notre Dame on the road. So all of a sudden, if Georgia Tech did that to you, why are we to think that Notre Dame can't do that to you? Frankly, that Florida can't do it. I could criticize Billy Napier to the high heavens. Florida, they at least play hard. They're not always disciplined, but they play hard. So you look at Florida, you look at Clemson, you look at Miami. This is a concern. And listen, I know it's not all on DJU, but I do think the pseudo-conservative play calling, that probably helped Georgia Tech, is that it was pretty clear that Mike Norvell did not want to challenge Georgia Tech deep for the most part, wanted to keep DJU's throws and reads short intermediary, and that just allowed Georgia Tech to creep up and creep up and creep up. And that's where I would be concerned, is why is it going to get better? By the way, I do have one other thought on Florida State, and this is not a tear down Florida State thing. I know we want to overreact. I know it's week 0. I get all that. But at the same time, I was thinking about this, and I did tweet it during the game. This is kind of the gift and the curse of the portal, right? Is that Florida State has not been an elite high school football program, or a high school football recruiting program. Last 3 recruiting classes, 12th in the country, 19th in the country, 20th in the country. But they have nailed their portal evaluations, and credit to them. But at the same time, when you look at portal recruiting, the portal is going to give, the portal is going to take away. There's going to be years where there's a ton of talent and you're going to get your fair share. There's going to be years where there's a ton of talent and you don't get your fair share. And there's going to be a lot of years where there just isn't as much talent and there are more things that you need to replace. And that's kind of was a concern of mine with Florida State coming into this year, is that they're not Georgia, they're not Ohio State, they're not whoever, even Alabama, that has so much depth because of the high school recruiting that even when you lose a lot, you got guys that are ready to go. And so you look at Florida State, I think what this is, they have nailed the portal recruiting, and maybe the talent just wasn't as good in the portal this year, whatever. But I do think this is the gift and the curse, as I said, of portal recruiting, because you just never know who's going to be available, who isn't, who you're going to get, who you're not. And then all of a sudden you're scrambling to fill important roles on your roster every single season. Now, really quickly, before we get out of here, and by the way, I'll do the caveat one more time. Florida State fans, if you're mad at me, that's fine. Plenty of time to bounce back. You get Boston College next Monday. By the way, that is that Labor Day Monday night game, Boston College at Florida State. So we'll see if it gets any better. Really quickly, got to give credit to Georgia Tech. You look at Georgia Tech and you look at this program, and this has been a program that has not been good for a very long time. You don't need me to tell you that. I get it. But Brent Key takes over last year, was the interim for the back half of the season before, gets them to 7-6. And this is a program that is very clearly trending in the right direction. By the way, I'm far from a high school football recruiting analyst, but the recruiting class is starting to look good. They have a 5-star offensive tackle already committed for 2025. The other guy we got to give credit to is Haynes King, man. I've been critical of Haynes King through the years. He's far from perfect. Make no mistake about that as a football player. But this was a guy, everybody got their cheap shots in with him when he was at Texas A&M. And I think we're starting to realize that maybe a lot of that was on Jimbo Fisher, because this guy was improved last year. this game in this game against Florida State, he wasn't incredible. He wasn't amazing. He wasn't the best quarterback that has ever walked planet Earth. Nobody's mistaking him for Patrick Mahomes. But 11 of 16 passing, 146 yards, couple big rushes, 54 yards rushing, about 4 yards per carry. So credit Georgia Tech. Now, listen, the one thing I'm not going to do from the Georgia Tech perspective, I want to give them credit, but that schedule is really tough that they have. They play at Georgia, or they play Georgia State at home next weekend, then at Syracuse, at Louisville to end September. And so you're talking about 3 games outside of Atlanta in their first 5 games of the year. Still have Notre Dame on the schedule, still have to go to a good Virginia Tech team, have to go to Georgia, obviously in your rivalry game, and get Miami at home. So it is a brutal schedule. I think ESPN listed it as like one of the 5 toughest schedules per analytics. Doesn't change the fact, though, that they get the win. They deserve the credit. Congrats, Georgia Tech fans. By the way, there is one other comment that's pretty good in the comments section before we switch gears, talk about some more week 0, and then get to my playoff picks. Paul asks, simple question. What was FSU's QB paid in NIL? He looks slow and not elusive. You get what you paid for. Welcome to pay for play. Maybe they can get a refund. So look, I will be honest. I actually had that exact thought, Paul, during the game, because I sat there and I was like, first of all, we've all seen DJU. And one thing I will say about the NIL era that I love is we can just be transparent about players, right? Because back in the day, even 4, 5, 6 years ago, it kind of felt like, is it really fair to go after a player? They're unpaid, they're student athletes, they're trying their best. Can we really criticize them that much? Well, the one thing that's great about the NIL here is everybody's making something. Certainly everybody's going to be making something next year when the schools are paying them straight out of, from the university. But what's wild is I had that thought as well, is like, if you're a Florida State booster, and listen, I get it. You're coming off a 13-1 season, ACC champion. So the fundraising was probably pretty good this offseason. You're probably sitting there like, this is what we paid for. This is the quarterback that I was told that we had to donate extra money to guarantee that we get this guy on campus. So this is the gift and the curse of the NIL world. Listen, this is something I think I've been a little bit ahead on more than, not everybody, but a lot of people in the media, is get that NIL money when the getting's good. And what I mean by that is what I believe we are going to increasingly see is I think donations are going to kind of ebb and flow with the vibe coming out of the program right now, right? So you go to, say, college basketball, John Calipari, it's like, yeah, he couldn't get any money at Kentucky because everybody's mad at him. So he goes to Arkansas. He's got maybe the best NIL fund in college basketball, as we talked about last week. Whatever. You go on and on down the list. And so if you're a Florida State fan, you're like, I gave all this money. If DJU leads you to a 7-5 season this year, you're probably sitting there saying, I'm going to think twice about donating some money because I'm not sure how I feel about how the program is allocating it. So again, this is the new NIL world. I'm glad that we could just kind of call a spade and be like, I don't know if that guy's good enough. And I'll be honest, I said it a minute ago. I think the line play is really the story of that game. They got beat up on both lines, which is kind of inexcusable. But I also look at DJU and I just sit there and say, I'm sorry. I don't believe that dude is good enough to win you the games that matter. Remember, they still have Clemson, at Notre Dame, at Miami. Again, I said it a minute ago, even at SMU. I know they didn't look great yesterday. We're going to talk a little bit about them in a second. But at SMU, Florida, late in the year, you play like you did yesterday. You play like you did on Saturday. Could easily be a 7-5, 6-6 type season for the Seminoles. Really quickly, I'll say this. I know, and I said this a minute ago, I whined a little bit about the week 0 slate. I still think we got to figure this out. Like, is it 1 game? Is it 5? Is it 10? But while I don't necessarily love how the schedule laid out, I got to call a spade and say, like, you know what? That was actually some pretty entertaining football after Florida State, Georgia Tech. No, we're not going to break down these games, but listen, think about these games that we have. So we talked about this on Thursday's show. Montana State, FCS team, was a 13.5-point favorite early going into the game at New Mexico. New Mexico, of course, is an FBS team that plays in the Mountain West. They were a 13.5-point favorite, Montana State. New Mexico, clearly, to quote Michael Jordan, they took that personally because New Mexico comes out. They play well. At one point, they're up 31-14 late in the third quarter going into the fourth. And then what happened? Well, we kind of saw why New Mexico was a double-digit home underdog against Montana State. Montana State scores 21 unanswered points, including a touchdown with like 7-8 seconds to go to stun New Mexico. So New Mexico, a 14.5-point home underdog. They have a 31-14 lead going into the fourth quarter and end up losing outright. So for those people who believe that New Mexico would not only cover, but probably put some money on the money line, I am sorry to you. That's about as bad of a beat as you're going to get. Down up 17 going into the fourth quarter at home, give up 21, you lose 35-31 in Albuquerque. Other game after that, by the way, another wild rally. We just mentioned it half a second ago. SMU, listen, first year in the ACC, 11 wins a year ago. And I think they're kind of like a frisky second tier type team in the ACC. Don't think they're Miami. Don't think they're Clemson. Didn't think they were Florida State prior to Saturday. But I did think, catch them on the wrong day, wrong spot. They could surprise some people. They struggled at Nevada. Nevada first-year head coach. And Nevada, one of the worst programs, frankly, over the last couple of years in college football. SMU, they were on the ropes, trailed 17-10 at half, 24-13 going into the fourth quarter. Again, much like the game before it, 16 unanswered points to win that game and to survive week 0 at Nevada. Now we'll see what happens from here going forward with SMU. SMU kind of interesting, a weirdly tough early schedule. Remember, they're in the ACC now. That's 4 out of conference games. So they survive at Nevada. Should take care of business this week against Houston Baptist. But then they have BYU in an out-of-conference game against the Big 12 foe. And then, oh, by the way, the Iron Skillet game with TCU. That is before league play. And league play, as I've said a few times now, opens with Florida State in Dallas. I am far from an SMU historian. My guess is that's probably the biggest home game since pre-death penalty, since the mid-1980s. That place is going to be wild, and I cannot wait to see what happens. By the way, the late game, Hawaii took care of business against Delaware State. Delaware State, of course, was the team that missed their flight to Hawaii. Had to wait like an extra day, chaos, whatever. It's just the world of college football, I guess. So week 0 is in the books. As I said, Tuesday night, we will do our full week 1 preview, and I cannot wait. I'm so excited for some of these games. LSU, USC, Miami, Florida, A&M, Notre Dame. You go on, and I'm excited about the Colorado game on Thursday night. I know some of you are tired of me talking about Coach Prime, but I think that's a fascinating game. We talked last week. If Colorado loses that game, they are in big, big, big trouble throughout the season. That's our week 0 recap. Again, week 1, we'll talk on Tuesday night. I mentioned earlier, Trey Wallace from Outkick will join me on Monday. But right now, that's what I want to do. I want to take a quick break. I want to come back. When I come back, about 2.5 weeks ago, we did our official playoff picks. No, some of you missed them. So we'll recap them really quick now that it's officially week 1. And then I've got a little bit of a surprising Heisman Trophy winner that I believe my preseason Heisman Trophy winner. I think you might be a little bit surprised with who I pick. I'll explain why. Quick break. Be right back. Before we do, many of you ask me all the time, Torres, what can I do to help support the show? You give me hours and hours and hours of content every single week. What can I do to help you? Well, I'll tell you what. Do me a quick favor. Check out the Aaron Torres Media merchandise store for all of your team-specific shirts, hats, and more. All available at aarontorresonline.com/merchandise. A lot of you wondering, Torres, what can I get in that merch store? Well, first of all, we got our brand new Hope and Pope Kentucky basketball t-shirts. That's right. Mark Pope has arrived. He is here to save the day. Get your Hope and Pope t-shirts there. Also, Arkansas fans, the Big Pig Invasion is here. You can get your tees there. Basketball School Alabama shirts. Mora Hurley 2024 UConn shirts for your tailgates at Rentschler Field, your games at the XL Center or Gamble. And oh, by the way, your Mike effing Woodson gear for Indiana. If you love football, we got you covered too. We got more Dion shirts and hats than we even know what to do with. The freeze warning has hit the plains. Auburn fans, grab your freeze warning tees now. And of course, our new era, new rules shirt applies to Nebraska football and its incredible fan base. We have more coming for the fall, plenty in stock right now. So make sure to check out the Aaron Torres Media merch store at aarontorresonline.com/merchandise. And you can always hit me up with any questions. Aaron Torres Podcast Questions at gmail.com. All right, everybody. I'm back. Gonna be back. So week 0 is in the books. Guys, girls, whoever's watching it this time, whoever's watching on replay, whoever's listening on podcast, it is so good. College football is here. I was really, up until I went on air on Fox Sports Radio at 11 Eastern to recap it all. By the way, I do host the Fox Sports Radio National Recap Show, 11 to 2 a.m. Eastern time every Saturday. So make sure you're paying attention to that. 600 stations nationwide. You can find me somewhere along with Jason Martin. But I bring it up. It was just so good to have football back. Listen, I love basketball, but, I think the basketball stuff's going to take a back burner here for a few months until we get closer to the season. Obviously, we'll hit on stuff as it happens. But I bring it up. It was so good to have football. And what I want to do now, I want to go ahead and give you, I guess, again, my playoff picks. Now, I know what a lot of people do, and what I probably should have done if I was a little bit smarter. They do like the way too early picks in late July, early August. Then you kind of wait till camp happens and you kind of adjust as needed. Well, I'm not going to do that. But the bottom line is I put them out about 2.5 weeks ago. I know a lot of you missed it. You're traveling. It's summer. Kids are off of school. By the way, we have a couple really cool sponsorship deals coming up that I think you'll like. And I'm talking about it because it's something in my mind just registered as I'm talking about football. So I bring it up anyway. A lot of you missed the 12-team playoff. And so what I want to do is very quickly recap it and give you my Heisman Trophy and college football playoff picks. Basically because guess what? Week 1 is now here, and it's time to start talking ball. And by the way, I will try to be as quick as I possibly can be on this. As many of you know, brevity is not my area of weakness. So let's go, not my area of strength, I should say. So let's go ahead and dive in. My 12-team playoff. And listen, I just said it. If you're listening to this show, I'm sure you already know, but a quick reminder, the way the 12-team playoff is set up, 4 first-round buys. Those buys only go to the 4 highest-rated conference champions. So if Georgia and Alabama or Georgia and Texas or Texas and Ole Miss, if they meet in the SEC championship game 1 versus 2, guess what? The loser does not get the first-round bye. The loser has to play on that opening weekend of the college football playoff. Seeds 5 through 12, they will play in that opening weekend. Those will be on campus. So we could see campus games in Tuscaloosa or Norman or Austin or wherever. And then from there, you get to the final 8, et cetera, et cetera. All right, let's get to my 12-team college football playoff. The first team in my 12-team college football playoff, number 1 overall seed. They are the SEC champion. Shocker, I know. The Georgia Bulldogs. Listen, Georgia, a couple things on them, and we'll be quick again. You talk about Georgia. Listen, there are very few instances when Kirby Smart can actually play the all-off season, nobody believed in us, chip on our shoulder card, okay? Well, this is one of them. And you go back to last year, they were, according to Vegas, the best team in college football. If they had played Michigan on a neutral field, they would have been favored. I picked Michigan up. It doesn't matter. The point is, they would have been the number 1 overall seed. They were maybe the best team. And I think the thing that stands out to me about Georgia, everybody focuses on the defense. They had a top 5 offense in college football. We'll talk Heisman in a second, but Carson Beck has as good of a shot as anybody to win the Heisman. Georgia, my SEC champion. Number 2 seed, Big Ten champion. I don't know if it's a little bit of a surprise or not. It's the Oregon Ducks. Now, listen, we'll talk about Ohio State in a minute. But when it comes to Oregon, listen, all I've heard all offseason is how complete of a team that Ohio State is. I think Oregon's right there. By the way, I hear all these concerns about Dylan Gabriel. Why are there no concerns about Will Howard? Will Howard is a much less accomplished quarterback than Dylan Gabriel. Dylan Gabriel goes to Oregon. Remember, they really don't have any marquee out-of-conference games. They do get Ohio State at home, and I believe, in my opinion, they are every bit as balanced of a team as Ohio State. Believe whatever happens in Eugene, they will potentially face the Buckeyes again in Indianapolis. We'll explain that in a minute. And whatever happens in Eugene, I think they go to Indianapolis from Oregon. The Neon Green, they are your Big Ten champion. Number 3 seed. Again, not saying this is the third best team in the country, but I was on this early. I've seen a lot of people flip their picks. But 3 weeks ago, I told you, I said, I believe Miami will be the ACC champion. Said it at a time when it was very convenient to pick Florida State Clemson. That hasn't changed. That wasn't impacted at all by week 0 on Saturday. Miami, listen, you talk to people across the sport and specifically across the ACC. They'll tell you Miami is the best team in the ACC on paper in terms of pure talent. Cam Ward comes from Washington State, 26 touchdown passes last year. Damian Martinez comes from Oregon State. By the way, Miami rated the Pac-2. Pac-2, that's all that's left. Washington State, Oregon State. Well, guess what? Their best respective players are now at Miami. You have a pair of bookend tackles who will both play in the NFL, and you got plenty of talent on defense that was only improved through the portal. Listen, you could criticize Mario Cristobal, but his final 3 years at Oregon, this was a guy that played for 3 Pac-12 titles, won 2 of them. He has the most talent in this league. I like Miami as my number 3 seed ACC champ. Number 4 seed, the Utah Utes, the Big 12 champ. Again, not saying Utah is the 4th best team in the country, but the Big 12 champ will get almost certainly one of those top 4 seeds. And so because of it, I have Utah. Thing about Utah, we'll learn very quickly about them. At Oklahoma State, Arizona, early in the season. Those are 2 top 25 teams coming into the year. So we're going to learn quickly about Utah. But Kyle Whittingham is a dude. Remember, this team won 8 games last year with the 3rd string quarterback. Previous 2 years, they won the Pac-12. They're tough. They're physical. I like them to win the Big 12. Excuse me. Let's get to my at-large teams. And again, we'll be quick. Number 5, it is the Big 10 runners-up, the Ohio State Buckeyes. Listen, I can be critical of Ryan Day, and I have been. If you've listened to this show, I don't know that I believe in him. The talent is overwhelming, though. We know about it. Will Howard, Quinshon Judkins, obviously the running back from Ole Miss. Receiver room is stacked. Travion Henderson, their leading rusher, is back. And the defense, I think, again, almost like the opposite of Georgia. We think of Georgia as this insane defense with this okay offense. Well, the offense was awesome for Georgia. It was the defense that carried Ohio State last year. They returned virtually everybody. If you want to pick Ohio State as your Big Ten champ, if you want to pick them as your national champ, I have no argument. I have them as the Big Ten runner-up. 6 seed, my SEC runner-up. This may be a little bit of a surprise. I have Kalen DeBoer and the Alabama Crimson tied as your SEC runners-up. Now, I get that the schedule is tough, but a few things on Alabama. 1, Kalen DeBoer is unbelievable. Okay, you go back to last year, remember. He went 2-0 against Dan Lanning, including that Pac-12 championship game. I tweeted this out the other day, but there was a replay of the Pac-12 championship game on ESPNU one of these nights. I'm just flipping channels. Final 8 or 9 minutes of that game. There was about 6-7 plays where Washington needed the perfect play. If they don't get it, they're giving Oregon the ball back with a chance to take the lead, a chance to win. Every single time, Kalen DeBoer, Ryan Grubb, who I understand is no longer with him, but those 2 came up with the perfect play. Kalen DeBoer is awesome, and I keep coming back to this is the most talented roster that he's ever going to have, that he's ever had, to this point in his career. So I have Alabama as my 6th seed, my SEC runner-up. 7 seed, also out of the SEC, do like Ole Miss. Now, Ole Miss is really interesting. We know why they're so highly regarded. Jackson Dart is back, 3rd year as a starter. Also, on top of that, talent all around him on the offensive side of the football. No, I just mentioned they lost Quinshon Judkins, but the Ulysses Bentley kid, some people believe will be just as good in that system. Trey Harris, elite wide receiver. And then, oh, by the way, we all understand that the defense was much improved through the portal, headlined by Walter Nolan, former number 1 high school player in America. Only concern with Ole Miss, I think that the schedule is a tiny bit trickier than people think. You look at, they just beat LSU last year. Well, they have to go to LSU. They haven't won at LSU since 2008. By the way, Ole Miss at Arkansas. Easy to just chalk that up as a win. Lane Kiffin is 0-2 as the Ole Miss head coach in Fayetteville. So I think there's a spot where they maybe get tripped up. I don't think they have quite the roster to get to Atlanta, but I think they get to 10-2. They figure out a way. They are in this playoff as the 7th seed. 8 seed, Notre Dame Fighting Irish. I'll be blunt. Don't love the roster of Notre Dame. I don't know with that schedule that it really matters that much. I mean, listen, you understand that Notre Dame is only playing 3 teams that are ranked in the top 25 this year, one in week 1 against A&M. Also, you play Florida State, which probably won't be ranked by the end of this week. And also they play USC, which might not be ranked by the end of week 1. So you're talking about a very manageable schedule. Even if they lose at A&M, they will probably be favored in their next 11 games. I just find it hard to see this team finishing worse than 10-2. 10-2 will get them in. I have Notre Dame as my 8 seed. Number 9 seed, the Michigan Wolverines. By the way, we had a Michigan NCAA update in the least shocking news ever. The NCAA decides to release their notice of allegations on Connor Stallions on Sunday. For people who don't understand how all this works, Michigan has 90 days to respond. Sharon Moore is not getting suspended. There will be no postseason ban. So it's full speed ahead for Michigan for at least this season. When I look at Michigan, listen, I think the culture is still in place. There is so much talent still on that defense. I'll also say this too. This is a little bit of a bet against Penn State. I just don't buy James Franklin in big games. He doesn't come through. I know the schedule for Penn State is manageable. I just don't trust him. So I need that third Big Ten team. Michigan plays Oregon at home, Texas in the out-of-conference at home, and at Ohio State. Think they just got to win 1 out of 3, finish 10-2. I have them as my 9 seed. I'll be quick. Texas at 10. Little lower on Texas than most. They lost 2 elite defensive linemen, top 30 or so picks in the draft, 35 picks, 40 picks, whatever. They also lost their entire receiver room. Xavier Worthy, A.D. Mitchell were both top 35 picks as well. Still think they'll be good, but the step up to the SEC, think the schedule gets a little bit more challenging. Think they find a way to get to 10-2, maybe 9-3. By the way, I would expect Texas to be given the benefit of the doubt when you factor in that they're challenging themselves going to Michigan in the out-of-conference. I have Michigan as my 10, or Texas as my 10 seed. 11, final at-large bid. I have the Clemson Tigers. And the reason I have the Clemson Tigers is pretty straightforward. I don't believe that the committee wants to set the tone that they are putting in only SEC and Big Ten teams as an at-large team. So I think if there's a worthy team out of the ACC, the Big 12, they'll find a way to get them in. Just say, hey, this isn't just the SEC and Big 12 invitation or Big 10 invitational, even if maybe it should be. So I have Clemson at number 11. 12, I have Liberty as my group of 5 representative in that bracket. All right, let's quickly rip through the quarterfinals. Notre Dame hosting Michigan, by the way. What a game that would be. A historic rival. I think Michigan's just better, and I think they're tougher, especially on the lines. I would have Michigan winning that game. On top of that, you go down the bottom part of the bracket, Ohio State. I don't think there's much to say there. I think they would cruise against Liberty. Top part of the bracket, Ole Miss against Texas, a true SEC game. That game would be in Oxford. And I'll be honest, Texas probably better 1 through 85, but I think Jackson Dart is every bit as good as Quinn Ewers. I think the wide receiver room is every bit as good as Texas is. And I think the front line of Ole Miss defense will do just enough. Ole Miss gets the win there. Alabama, Clemson. How about that as an opening round game? I would have Alabama winning that one as well. By the way, for people who are listening on podcast, I apologize that there are no great visuals for this, but it's a heck of a bracket to look at, okay? So let's get to the final 8, I guess it would be. First one, the game that everybody wanted last year, 9 seed Michigan versus Georgia. All of the final 8, of course, will be on a neutral site. Listen, I think Georgia, this is where Michigan, the run ends. I don't think they're going to have enough at the quarterback position, and Georgia's not a team that you're just going to be able to run over. I think Georgia advances to the Final Four. A little bit of an upset. Utah, the Big 12 champion against Ohio State. Power rankings have Ohio State as either number 1 or number 2 in the country behind Georgia. I have Utah pulling off the upset. Listen, Ryan Day, these are the teams that he struggles with. Tough, physical along the line of scrimmage. I got Utah winning that game. Top part of the bracket, Ole Miss versus Oregon. That is, again, on a neutral field. This is where I think Ole Miss, the dream ends for them, for lack of a better term. Oregon, too many bodies, too many big dudes. Dan Lanning has built a monster up there. So I got Oregon advancing to the Final Four. Alabama versus Miami. I know what I said earlier about Mario Cristobal, and I'm not a believer in Mario Cristobal on game day. And this is where it catches up to him. I mean, Mario Cristobal versus Kalen DeBoer, that's a mismatch. That's a 1 versus a 16 seed in the NCAA tournament, I'm sorry to say. So I have Alabama advancing to the Final Four, with our top 4 teams being Georgia and Utah on one side of the bracket, Oregon and Bama on the other side of the bracket. First part of the bracket, Georgia and Utah. Give me Georgia. I think Georgia, well, I don't want to say what I think, but I am as the number 1 seed. Think they're as good as anybody in college football. Beyond that, I think they cruise in that one. And then, of course, the other part of the bracket, Oregon against Bama. Now, I know Bama fans are going to say Kalen DeBoer's 3-0 against Dan Lanning, and I do think there is something to be said about that. I also just find it very hard to believe that I think, this would be the 3rd straight game for Alabama, the 4th straight if you factor in that by that point they will have, of course, played in the SEC championship game. So go ahead and give me Oregon to win that one. It sets up a national championship game of Georgia versus Oregon. If you listen to the original show, I went back and forth on this one quite a bit. Ultimately, I'm going to take Georgia. And listen, I think Oregon is certainly good enough to win a national championship. I think they have the 2nd best roster in the country behind only Georgia. The thing with Georgia, though, is you look at them, and one, I think as much as anybody, they're built for this 12-team playoff era. But then also, this is one of the few off seasons where Kirby Smart can give the nobody believes in us. So they get in, they're the SEC champ. Carson Beck was awesome last year. I keep going back to that offense. So much better than people gave it credit for. I have Georgia over Oregon as your 2020, I guess it'd be 2025 national. I still don't know. By the way, I've been covering this sport for 15 years. I still don't know. Is it the 2024 champ, 2025 champ? It'll be crowned in January. All I know is that Georgia will be my preseason national champ. And I know, super sexy pick having my 1 versus 2 seed playing for the championship and the 1 seed winning. I know that's really going out on a limb there. By the way, would love to hear your guys' comments and thoughts. Who do you have in your national championship? Who do you have in your Final Four? I would love to see some people, their thoughts on what they got to say on that. By the way, I do see my buddy Jake Fagus is in there saying no Arizona. I love the Wildcats, man. It's just, listen, what am I going to do? There's only so many teams that can get in from the Big 12. And also, by the way, Arizona has a brutal schedule by Big 12 standards. By the way, the weird game, they already had a game scheduled with Kansas State. So Kansas State is technically an out-of-conference game. So, hey, you got a top 15 team on the road in the out-of-conference. Then you play at Utah. I don't think at BYU is going to be easy. And then you close the season at Central Florida. You also have on the schedule Houston as well, which should be improved. West Virginia is kind of an interesting team. Good news is you do avoid some of the other big teams, the Kansases of the world, the Oklahoma States of the world. Love you, Jake. I just think it's probably a little bit too much for the Arizona Wildcats. Noah Fafita, though, is awesome. Really quickly, because I have not done it as of yet, let's go ahead and talk Heisman, okay? So first of all, producer Matt, when you get a second, let's go ahead and put up those odds. These are courtesy of FanDuel Sportsbook. Just going to give you the top 10. Dylan Gabriel, the favorite at plus 500, quarterback from Oregon. Carson Beck at plus 800, Quinn Ewers at plus 1,200, Will Howard at plus 1,400. In truly shocking news, the 4 quarterbacks of the top 4 teams in the country that everybody agrees are the best teams are the top 4 candidates, according to FanDuel. Then from there, Nico Imamalieva, Tennessee's quarterback, plus 1,400, Jalen Milroe, plus 1,400, Jackson Dart, plus 1,400, Cam Ward, of course, from Miami, plus 1,400, Garrett Nussmeier, a little surprising at plus 1,800, Avery Johnson, not the point guard from the San Antonio Spurs, not the former Alabama football coach. I am, of course, talking about Avery Johnson, the Kansas State quarterback, is plus 2,500. So I'll be honest. In terms of my Heisman Trophy pick, the first initial, I do like Dylan Gabriel a little bit. Now, he's not my official pick. I'll get to it in a second. I do like Dylan Gabriel because I think that offense is built for him. It's dink and dunk. It's get rid of the ball, and they got dudes all over the field. if Oregon beats Ohio State at home, if Oregon wins the Big Ten in their first year, I think he's going to be an easy guy to wrap your arms around. By the way, I think by that point, it would kind of get out that he was sort of forced out at Oklahoma. Because, you hear these narratives of, he just hit the portal after the season. It's like, no. Oklahoma was ready to move on to Jackson Arnold. And so I think you start to understand he got kind of forced out at Oklahoma, goes to Oregon, wins the Heisman. I could see him being in the mix. Don't love, Quinn Ewers is fine. I think Carson Beck is probably a pretty safe, logical bet. I don't get the Will Howard stuff. I'll tell you what, if you want a true long shot, rather than betting Will Howard, I'd bet Quinshon Judkins, which, if my math is correct, is plus 10,000 to win the Heisman, because ultimately all Will Howard's going to be doing is handing off the ball or throwing short passes, letting his players make plays in space. Chip Kelly wants to run the ball. Travion Henderson, unfortunately, I hate to say it, gets hurt a lot. So my hunch would be just take Quinshon Judkins if you want an Ohio State guy. But I beat around the bush long enough. Who is my actual Heisman pick? Enough yapping, Torres. My Heisman pick, this might surprise some people. I have Jackson Dart, plus 1,400, the Ole Miss quarterback, to win the Heisman Trophy. Look at that graphic if you're watching on YouTube. Beautiful graphic from producer Matt. Thought process on this. There's a couple reasons why. The first one, with Jackson Dart. One, first of all, third-year starter in that system. Listen, this is kind of an underrated thing. I think it's kind of hard to just step in and be awesome moment one. Look back at Jaden Daniels. Was awesome last year, second year in the system. Michael Penix, second year in the system. Bo Nix, second year in the system. Joe Burrow, it's easy to forget, had kind of an up and down first year at LSU. They hired Joe Brady, lightning in a bottle, and all of a sudden Joe Burrow is the best quarterback, statistically one of the best quarterbacks we've ever seen in college football. So you go through all these guys, even Caleb Williams, second year in Lincoln Riley's system. Second, third year is kind of where you pop. Well, Jackson Dart has been awesome. I think he's going to be even better. Those wide receivers are unbelievable. Trey Harris, I think, might be the most underrated wide receiver in college football. But if that defense is better, Ole Miss is going to be in the mix for everything late in the year. Now, I told you a second ago, I don't believe that they are going to play for an SEC title, but I don't think that precludes them from being in the conversation late in the year. And so if they're in the conversation late in the year, they're kind of a non-traditional team. And I think we start talking about a couple different things. The value of a guy, right? I mean, go back to Michael Penix last year. Go back to Bo Nix last year. We all kind of understood those two teams are in the conversation because their quarterbacks are awesome. Statistically, they're putting up good numbers. And I do think there's a couple other variables as well. One, Lane Kiffin, when his guys are in the mix for these awards, he's not afraid to feed the beast, right? You go back to a decade ago, he had Marquise Lee at USC. The team was falling apart, but he kept feeding Marquise Lee the ball because he's like, if we're not winning anything, at least let's get this guy the Biletnikoff Award. So I think that Lane Kiffin's going to do what he has to do to feature him. The other thing with college football, which we all know, is that guys are, voters, guys, girls, whatever. They always like the story. Like, isn't the Heisman more than anything? It's about the story. Like, I don't know what the NBA MVP, like, I don't know that anybody really cares about the story. It's just like, okay, who was the best player? Best statistics, give it to him. NFL MVP, we certainly don't care. But the Heisman, everybody loves the Heisman. Oh, they overcame so much adversity. Oh, the mom did this and she drove them to practice 6 hours each way and blah, 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 this, that. So I bring it up because we've seen Ohio State quarterbacks win the Heisman before. Dylan Gabriel's obviously walking into a great situation. Quinn Ewers has been around forever. Carson Beck, oh, wow, he's the quarterback of the best team in the country. And I'm not saying it's fair, but I think everybody would be like, well, I mean, anybody could win the Heisman as the quarterback of Georgia. And so if Ole Miss is like 9-1, whatever that, 8-1 going into that Georgia game, if they somehow pull off the upset, even if they don't, but it's close and competitive, that's why I have Jackson Dart. Veteran in that system, knows that system. Remember, by the way, Lane Kiffin brought in guys last year to beat him out for the job. He won it. He's going to put up stats. Ole Miss is going to be good, and they're going to be in the conversation late. Jackson Dart is my official Heisman Trophy pick for the 2024 season. All right, let's go ahead and wrap with one more story. It is a story that broke on late Friday. Of course, it was the Friday news dump. And it's a story that we talked about actually a ton on this show about a year ago. It involves my alma mater, the University of Connecticut, and those pesky rumors about a potential leaving the Big East for the Big 12. And so the report break, first of all, credit where it's due. I wish I had figured out who it was, but it was about probably 10 days ago. One of these Big 12 podcasts, it might have been Locked On the Big 12 or one of these podcasts, like they put out a report that they put out a podcast where they said UConn, Big 12, that's starting to ramp up again. And I had a bunch of UConn fans send it to me. You know, I did my due diligence, whatever. We didn't talk about it on the show. But I bring it up because Friday afternoon, The Athletic put out a report that UConn and the Big 12 are back in discussions again after those two sides spoke quite a bit, really the spring of 2023 through the summer of 2023. Now, we're going to get into why that fell apart in a minute because I think that's important. But I think the important new twists from the last couple months with UConn and the Big 12 are this, is that UConn, again, whoever reached out, UConn was actually in the Big 12 offices last week. They presented a proposal where all the sports that the Big 12 sponsors would come except for football, and that football would wait until 2031 to be a full member of the Big 12. Now, why is that important? It is because 2031 is actually when the current Big 12 media rights deal expires. And so that's important because what UConn's basically saying is whatever money you guys got for football, we do not want to mess with it. And also what kind of held up UConn a year ago was that a lot of the Big 12 school presidents really weren't sold on UConn as an athletic department because of the football program. So what UConn's basically saying is, hey, give us 6 years, 5 years to get our stuff in order, and we will bring a program that's ready to compete in the Big 12. Now, I'll say this, maybe it's my UConn bias, but I think in the NIL era, if UConn had Power 4 conference football money, I think UConn could be competitive in like 3 years. That might sound crazy. It might sound insane, but look at Kansas. Kansas has the right coach. Overnight, you got a little NIL. You can retain your players. You hit on a couple guys, and all of a sudden, Kansas is actually a very viable team in the Big 12. They could win the Big 12 this year. Arizona's good. So, I mean, UConn doesn't need a ton. What they can have is what they have right now, which is like $12 million in TV money in a world where everybody's going to pay 20 plus million to their athletes starting next year. And so that's what has happened. Apparently now Brett Yormark, the Big 12 commissioner, is going to now present to his school presidents this week. And so I want to get into it. I want to discuss, but really to understand why, listen, I believe this is a thing. I don't believe it's nothing. I think we're probably talking about UConn has crossed the 50-yard line, but I don't believe they're in the red zone. I don't believe they're on the goal line. I don't believe this is getting done in the next week or the next 3 weeks or the next this or the next that. And to fully understand why, let me go ahead and explain, because ultimately I do think that you need the context of last year to understand why somebody like me kind of is a little dubious about how quickly this is going to come together. So if you go back to last year, what I can tell you is I really started to hear some Big 12 UConn rumors right around the Final Four of 2023, okay? Now, that's an important date. Remember, that was the year UConn played San Diego State in the national championship game. FAU was there. Miami was there. But I'm at the Final Four. You start hearing whispers. And what's important to remember about that time frame, this was before the Pac-12 broke up. This was before SMU and Cal and Stanford were part of the ACC. At this moment in time, all that had happened in realignment, Texas and Oklahoma had officially left for the Big 12, or from the Big 12 to the SEC. UCLA and USC had officially left for the Big 10, but the other 10 schools in the Pac-10 were still intact. Pac-12 were still intact. And so that's an important thing because that's where we were at that moment in realignment. And what I can tell you, the belief in circles that mattered was this, was that the Pac-12 was trying to figure out their TV contract. And my understanding was the Pac-12 or the Big 12 kind of knew. Colorado wants out. Colorado's been waiting for a TV contract. The Pac-12 can't come up with anything. Colorado's ready to leave. They're gonna go to Pac-12 Media Day, say all the right things, but they're ready to bounce. They're ready to get out. They're ready to do something different. They want the guaranteed money of the Big 12. And so Colorado was in. Then from there, my understanding was that UConn was next in line. This is in the spring of 2023. And the reason being really twofold. One, Brett Yormark, remember, Big 12 commissioner. Where did he come from? He's a Northeast guy, worked at Rock Nation, which is, of course, the agency based out of New York City. And Brett Yormark really wanted UConn for a few reasons. One, he wanted the Northeast brand, the Northeast corridor, kind of, UConn, they're as relevant as anybody in the Northeast. Maybe Penn State's a little bit more because of football, whatever. But UConn is available. That's who we want. Two, UConn falls in line with what Brett Yormark wanted from his expansion candidates. He wanted Colorado for the football reasons. But two, what Brett Yormark's goals are, and I think I was probably the first one in the national media on this. One, he knows that he can't build a better football conference than the SEC and the Big 12. Those schools do not exist. There are no schools that the Big 12 can realistically get that make them better or on par with the SEC and the Big 10. Even if they got Clemson and Florida State, they're still not there. And so what Brett Yormark's goal is, put together the best football conference that you can. And from there, what I want to do is build the best basketball conference that has ever existed. And the thought process on this, we talked about this a ton in the spring of 23. I had a bunch of people retweeting things that I said on the show at that time. The thought process there is pretty straightforward. It's if we build the best basketball conference that has ever existed, if one day in the future, the SEC and the Big Ten try to break off and do their own thing, well, listen, they're going to have all the clout in football. I can't change that. But they're going to have to include us because even if football controls like 99% of the narrative, and that's hyperbole, but 80% of the narrative in college football, in college sports, people still love the college basketball tournament. And so if you're going to put on a college basketball tournament, you got to put it on with the Big 12, which had Kansas at the time, which had Houston at the time. And obviously the goal was get UConn. Also, by the way, believe that Arizona was in the mix at that time without Arizona State, which we'll discuss in a minute, Gonzaga as well. So those were Brett Yormark's thoughts. I believe like late April of last year, I think that's what he thought was going to happen. From there, two big things happened that really screwed things up from the UConn perspective, from Yormark's perspective, is first off, he couldn't get the school presidents on board. And the school presidents, again, I think there was concerns about football. How competitive will they be? Do we want to bring them in? They're great at basketball, but what about football? But two, so he couldn't get the school presidents on board. But the big thing that happened, Pac-12 fell apart. And I know I'm going deep into this, but you need the context to understand why we are back to where we are today. And so when the whole conversation started, the Big 12 had a pretty good feel Colorado's out. They're not coming back. But I bring it up to very simply say that I think the Pac-12 thought everybody was going to stay. And then what happened? And by the way, they were going to stay because people didn't have better options. It's easy to forget at the time. But obviously, Oregon State, Washington State, Cal, Stanford had no better option. Oregon and Washington really didn't have the Big Ten option at the time. And so they were kind of stuck. Arizona State wanted to stay in the Pac-12. That is indisputable. Go back, my buddy Mike Luke, my buddy Jason Shear talked about it for days on end. ASU school president doesn't care about sports. He didn't want to be bothered switching a league. Utah wanted to stay in the Pac-12 because they were like, we're dominating this league. Let's keep this thing together because we're kicking everybody's butt. So at the time, you think it's going to stay together. And then, boom, like that overnight, it falls apart. Arizona wants out. Now, all of a sudden, Arizona State's like, well, if Arizona's leaving, I better get my butt on board as well. But really what it stemmed from was that awful TV contract that was terrible. I forget all the details, but it was like an Apple TV deal. Like you get $20 million a year and whatever. But everybody was like, that is unacceptable. So all of a sudden now Utah and Arizona State are willing to leave. Oregon and Washington are willing to take less than a full share to go from the Pac-12 to the Big Ten. And then boom, the league falls apart. League falls apart. Arizona State, Colorado, Utah go to the Big 12. And at that point, the Big 12 is like, we're not expanding. So that is how the very long-winded story of UConn did not end up in the Big 12 a year ago. Well, fast forward, and what I think is interesting is a couple things. One, UConn very clearly understands the football thing is a crutch. How do we work around this? Well, we wait till 2031. We wait till the TV contract is over. We'll figure out a way to make it work. But two, what also stands out is positives and negatives on both sides. I don't believe on a positive side that Brett Yormark ever stopped wanting UConn. He understands the value of the UConn brand in the Northeast. He understands, by the way, this is a guy multiple people have reported. The next TV contract, he's going to try to sell the basketball rights separate from the football rights. So UConn is a very valuable asset. I'll be blunt. I know this for a fact. That big TV deal that the Big East just signed, they just signed a new TV deal. UConn is a big part of why they got the number that they got. It's still not SEC Big 10 money. It's not even ACC Big 12 money, but the money would have been much less without UConn. So I bring it up. That's the positive. The negative, and this is why I didn't rush to YouTube to do an immediate reaction on Friday. I still don't know if Brett Yormark is going to get sign off from the Big 12 league presidents. Got to get 12 out of 16 to agree to add UConn. Then from there, you got to figure out who else are you going to add with them. 17 is kind of a weird number. And so I know I've been talking about this topic for probably like 13 minutes now or whatever. I don't know that we're near a finish line. I think because it leaked, I don't think it's 0%, but I think the same issues that UConn ran into a year ago, they're going to continue to run into. Can you convince that Texas Tech school president to get on board, that Baylor school president, that West Virginia school president to get on board? And then most importantly, you got to explain to them, one, how it's not going to mess with your money. In other words, are these schools going to get less money? Brett Yormark has promised that they won't. But then two, as importantly, how does this make more money? And I think Brett Yormark is going to do the 30,000 foot, if we get these schools, think about what the next TV contract could look like. But at the same time, we're not there yet. And so it's hard for me to get excited. It's hard for me to believe that we're at the finish line. Could be dead wrong. Don't think I am, though. Couple quick notes before we get out of here, because I get asked this all the time from the UConn perspective. Why would UConn want to leave the Big East? By the way, this is a misinformed fact. Why would UConn want to leave the Big East again? First off, UConn never left the Big East. UConn got kicked out of the Big East in whatever it was, 2012, 2013. The Big East was an all basketball conference. Nobody had FBS football. And I bring it up because UConn was playing FBS football. So there was no league for them to play in, and they got kicked out. They come back, but why would they leave the Big East again? The reason is let me even backtrack. People think, they're going to leave because they want to keep building up football. No. It's actually because they want to protect all the other sports. As I said, you go forward to next year, schools are going to be able to pay $20 million a year to their players. I don't know how it's all going to get dispersed, whatever. But guess what? You know who's going to be screwed? Everybody that's not in one of those Power Four conferences. Because here's the bottom line. I think the new TV deal for the Big East, which doesn't even kick in for another year, I think it's for like $15 million a year, okay? So I'm not great at math. But if everybody else is paying $20 million to their athletes, you only got $15 million in TV money. And remember, the Big Ten schools, the SEC schools are going to be getting $60 or $70 million. Not great at math, but when you got to pay out 20 to keep up with everybody, and you only got 12, 13, 14, 15, whatever it is. Not great at math. Math doesn't really add up. So that is why UConn wants to align themselves with the Big 12 or a power football conference. It's not really about football. It's to make sure that basketball can continue to operate at the highest level. We talked about this when Dan Hurley interviewed for the Lakers. Well, guess what? If Dan Hurley leaves in 3 years, 2 years, 1 year, like you want to be in position where you can continue to maintain at the highest level, and you don't have to hope that you somehow pull a rabbit out of your hat and hire someone as good as Dan Hurley, because I don't think that person exists. So that's the logic behind it. By the way, last thought, because I know I'm going really long here, because I know a lot of people have asked me. My understanding is the two biggest advocates on campus for this move, besides Jim Mora, obviously the football coach, are Dan Hurley and Gino Auriemma. They understand the future of college sports. You got to be tied to a Power Four football conference. You have to have that revenue coming in, or it's going to be really hard to survive. Gino Auriemma, I was told like last year when this was going on, he was the biggest advocate on campus. He understood. He's given his life to the University of Connecticut, and he wants to see this thing maintain well beyond when he's gone. And so I don't know where we're at, but that's how I think we ended up here. Woo! Didn't think that I was going to end up doing like 20 minutes on UConn. Wow. That was a long UConn segment. But anyway, tell you what, I do think it's time to get out of here. We do have one UConn, we have one UConn comment, but it's okay. We don't have to get to it, but that's a full show. People, I just gave you an hour and 5 without any breaks. That's how we do shows in September on the Aaron Torres pod, baby. We ain't slow it down. I am so excited for what is ahead this year. If you're not subscribed, can you do your boy a favor? Aaron YouTube. Click the little subscribe button at the bottom of the screen. Put on the notifications. We're going live 3, 4, 5 times a week going forward because it's game week. Listen, if you guys and girls grinded with me through May and June and July, reward yourself. Make sure that you're subscribed. Also, make sure you're subscribed to the podcast on Apple or Spotify. Put on notifications there so you know when we go live. Leave a rating and review. By the way, I'll have a couple new social handles. I got a Facebook page that we're going to start posting some clips on, so make sure you're subscribed there. We'll get that to you in the chat going forward. But all the other ones, Aaron_Torres on Twitter, Aaron Torres Pod on Instagram, Aaron Torres Podcast Questions at gmail.com, Aaron Torres Podcast Questions at gmail.com. Tell you what, that's all for today's show, basically because I'm exhausted. That was a grind of a show, but a really fun show. It's fun to have stuff to talk about. Oh, by the way, as I said, we will be back Monday night with my buddy Trey Wallace from Outkick.com. Great friend, knows the SEC as well as anybody. We will make our official Week 1 picks on Tuesday night. And then come Thursday, we're reacting to games, baby. It's a fun time of year. Appreciate your support. Make sure you're subscribed. Appreciate you. We'll be back